अलावा उर्दू, हिंदी, संस्कृत आदि भाषाओं की ज्ञाता हैं और विशेष रूप से नौटंकी और पारसी थिएटर पर पिछले 10-15 वर्ष से अध्ययन करती रही हैं। दिलचस्प बात यह है कि वो रंगमंच की ओर साहित्य के माध्यम से आई, साहित्य से शुरू करके रंगमंच की ओर पहुंचे। इस दृष्टि से मुझे विशेष रूप से एक प्रसन्नता है क्योंकि मैं भी साहित्य से ही शुरू करके रंगमंच की ओर भटक गया हूँ। तो एक अपना एक सहयोगी, सहधर्मी के रूप में भी मैं उनका आज इस संध्या में विशेष रूप से स्वागत करता हूँ। जैसा आप जानते हैं वो आपके सामने स्त्रियों की भूमिका, पारसी थिएटर में स्त्रियों की भूमिका, फीमेल इम्पर्सोनेटर एंड जेंडर फॉर्मेशन इन पारसी थिएटर, इस विषय पर बात करेंगे। बहुत सुगमता से और बहुत विश्वास के साथ वो हिंदी में बातचीत करती हैं, बोलती हैं, पर अपने व्याख्यान के लिए उन्होंने अंग्रेजी में ही बोलना तय किया है और मेरा अनुमान है कि वो उसके बाद और बातचीत में प्रश्नों इत्यादि के उत्तर में हिंदी का प्रयोग करेंगे। और इसके पहले कि मैं उनको यहाँ बोलने के लिए आमंत्रित करूँ, मैं कीर्ति से कहूँगा कि वो उनको प्रतिष्ठान की ओर से फूल। डॉक्टर कैथरीन हैंसन आपके सामने अपना कवि प्रस्तुत करेंगे। डॉक्टर कैथरीन हैंसन।
Extremely happy to be here today because so many of my teachers and friends and colleagues, distinguished men and women in the theater, have gathered here to greet me. I just arrived in India about 10 days ago and the welcome has been overwhelming. So thank you very much, particularly to Mr. Natarang and the people of Natarang and the National School of Drama for organizing this opportunity to speak. I have to also ask your forbearance. I've been suffering with a cold and cough, not because of Delhi smog or anything like that. From London, I brought this with me. So I hope that I'll be able to hold up, and I beg your indulgence. Gender roles for women in Indian society. But what did it mean when men played their parts, as was so often the case in pre-modern performance traditions? Were the paradigms of womanly virtue parodied by the cross-dressed actor, or did his masquerade contribute to the construction of a powerful ideal? How was the spectator's gaze focused by the conventions of female impersonation? How closely did the stylizations of dramatic genres in different periods correspond to social practices of female attire and comportment? Such questions have rarely been asked, perhaps because they expose to self-conscious inquiry a practice so ubiquitous and widely accepted in South Asia as to appear invisible. Bringing theatrical transvestism into the limelight, moreover, threatens to reinvigorate stereotypes of effeminacy among the male population, a bitter legacy of colonial domination that lingers in post-colonial India. In theater, women have been represented by men. What does it mean for women as a social group when they are figured on such alien bodies? For whom or in whose interests are these gender categories produced? And how are they consumed? Here, I will attempt a limited response to these issues by looking at material I've gathered from the Parsi theater and its history. The period covered is from 1853, when Vishnu Das Bhave and his troupe performed Raja Gopichan in Hindustani before a public audience in Bombay, and sparked a wave of theater activity among Parsi college youth. The period extends to 1931, when the first sound feature film, Alamara, was released, also in Bombay, following which the Parsi theater began to wane. While the geographical focus is on western and northern India, the extensive tours of the Bombay-based troops to Madras and Ceylon, Calcutta and Rangoon, Peshawar and Sindh, and points in between, and the founding of innumerable local and regional groups styled after the Bombay companies, extend the implications of the argument to a wider territory. Avoided, and displaced for decades. I do not mean to imply that the Parsi theater and its successor, the silent cinema, were not significant sites of gender formation. Bringing the heretofore invisible woman onto the stage constituted a rupture, both with the systemic segregation of respectable women and their exclusion from public life, and with the practices of mehfil and court performance, wherein patrons exercised exclusive control over female performers. But within the urban entertainment economy, factors such as the high degree of publicity and access, the new set of relationships between spectators and actors, and the profit-making goals of management configured the represented woman, the actress or her surrogate, as an object of visual consumption of the Indian woman, the Bharatiya Nari of the nationalists. Before that, she is neither truly Bharatiya nor indeed a Nari. More specifically, I argue that preconceptions about the difficulty of finding actresses have been utilized to dismiss or evade the phenomenon of female impersonation. It has been held that because of the stigma connected to acting and the relegation of singing, dancing, and other performance arts to a marginalized courtesan class, women were at an extreme social disadvantage with respect to the stage, and were not only unwilling to become actresses, but were ill-equipped for its rigors and lacking in skills. Society, I will detail the strategies by which actors, managers, and reformists restricted women's access to the profession. The historical record shows that for a considerable duration, the employment of female impersonators and actresses overlapped, and they effectively competed against each other. Companies and publics then chose whom they wanted to represent women on the stage, men or women. The contest remained unresolved well into the 1920s, when Bal Gandhar of the Marathi stage and Jai Shankar Sundar of the Gujarati stage achieved unparalleled popularity. While there is no need to outline the major themes of social history or the status of women in this period, several points about the Parsi theater and its relation to the Parsi community perhaps need to be clarified. The community of Parsis. Amateur theater groups became fashionable among Elphinstone College youth in Bombay around 1850. Shortly thereafter, Parsi business managers and shareholding actors organized the first professional theater companies. Until roughly 1875, the languages of the plays were English and Gujarati. After the successful staging of the Inder Sabha, companies turned increasingly to Urdu dramatists and the Indo-Muslim corpus. Until the 1920s, almost all of the Urdu dramas written, and there were hundreds of them, were written under contract for the Parsi theater. In the first decades of the 20th century, the Hindu epics became very popular along with romantic social dramas, and the language now understood as Hindi gradually became the medium of choice. Writers, actors, company managers, musicians, and theater service personnel belonged to a mix of backgrounds. Audiences similarly were diverse, comprised initially of British officials and elite Parsis, then centering on the middle class of 19th century Bombay, and eventually including a large share of the laboring population, especially migrants, to the rapidly industrializing metropolis. A range of ticket prices accommodated the different classes of public. By language, this public spoke Gujarati, Marathi, Urdu, Hindi, Tamil, and other languages. Certainly, the association of community with linguistic identity was not yet, including the Gujarati and Marathi play companies, and also they were used as a culture of Bombay as a unity rather than to separate off the Parsi theater. And it's within this entire newly emerging entertainment economy that I wish to pose the questions about performing women. Families, playing women's roles in an urban environment. And they started off primarily with Shakespeare. The first on record is one D.N. Parikh, who was later a medical doctor and lieutenant colonel in the Indian Medical Service. A good example of the first is the famous Parsi actor Khurshidji Baliwala, who at about the age of 19 is on record as having been playing female roles, but later, of course, he switched over to male roles and became very well known for them. He also went on to become a director and company manager, and so on. Performers were extremely valuable members of the companies. Whenever there was a split or a kind of offshoot, one company moving away from another, the most urgent business was to immediately find a female impersonator to replace the one who had defected. Otherwise, the success of the entire performance would be in jeopardy. Invited by Sir Salarjung, females for the first time, although the play is said to have been a flop. Dadi Patel was still engaged in intense competition with Nazir. To insult his rival, he prepared a drop scene with a picture of himself as a beautiful youth and Nazir as a huge snake, presumably illustrating the theme of Krishna subduing the serpent demon Kaliya. The transition had now begun, and other companies continued the trend to bring in actresses, although not without controversy. Female impersonators likewise held their ground and remained as popular as ever. When Jahangir Kambata founded the Empress Victoria Theatrical Company in Delhi in 1877, he took full advantage of the talents of a popular female impersonator known as Naslu Sarkari. His real name was Nasrabanji Ratnaji Sarkari. Famed for his sweet Kokil Kant, cuckoo voice, Naslu played the subs pari to Kawas Katao's Gulfam in the Inder Sabha. He was Layla with Katao's Majnun, Bakavali with Katao's Tajul Mulk, and performed a number of other classic themes opposite the hero known as India's Irving. What happened to Naslu Sarkari when Mary Phantom entered the scene? This story has been recounted in the following fashion. During one of the rehearsals of the Inder Sabha, a doll carved out of marble, a huri from heaven, came looking for a Deshi Agni. Mary Phantom, the daughter of a retired Irish soldier, was herself an entertainer. She put on magic lantern shows and had come to book the hall where the Parsi troupe was performing. She admired Katao's acting, met him, and a romance ensued. Mary, who already spoke Hindi and Urdu, is said to have been trained in singing and acting by Katao. Eventually, the two were married, although they later separated. Mary Phantom's appearance on the Parsi stage launched a new era. Her ability to mimic Parsi and Hindu modes of femininity, her touching singing, her accurate pronunciation, acting talent, and fair skin, as well as the salacious stories circulating about her relations with various actors, created a sensation in the theater. But it also sparked dispute, and it led Katao to split with Kambata, leaving and forming yet again another company. Sometimes performances were held for women only. Parlanashin women would be accommodated within a special seating area. But it's also said that prostitutes from the town came and sat in the same section. A similar policy line was followed by the New Alfred Company. Again, the actress issue was held accountable for internal dissension that led to its founding. And I'll spare you the details of the splinter groups that formed to give rise to this. But the important figure here is one Sohrabji Ogra, who, unlike Kabra, was from a poor family and had no formal education. He was known for his complete opposition to allowing women to perform, and never even permitted his wife or children to see a play, let alone perform in one. Because of his rigid stance, the company banned actresses for over 40 years, until his death in 1933. He is said to have enforced strict discipline within his company, although on stage he mostly acted the role of a comedian. Not surprisingly, the New Alfred acquired the reputation of being one of the most orthodox and respectable Parsi troupes, and as a result attracted the likes of Madan Mohan Malviya and Motilal Nehru to its performances. A number of female impersonators were associated with the New Alfred: Amrit Lal, Narmada Shankar, Master Nisar, and Motilal. And Ogra is said to have specially sought out young boys from the Gujarat countryside. throughout the latter half of the 19th century. And now I'll sum up a few of the facts about Jayashankar Sundari and Bal Gandharv. I think probably many people in the audience are already quite familiar with these two very famous female impersonators. But so I'll go rapidly through this section. Jayashankar Sundari received the Padma Bhushan in 1971. He dominated the ranks of female impersonators in the Gujarati theater from 1901, when he starred in Saubhagya Sundari, the role that gave him his stage name, to 1932, when he retired from the commercial theater. For most of this time, he was a member of the Gujarati Natak Mandir, based at the Gaiety Theatre in Bombay. The early stages of Sundari's career may be rather representative of female impersonators. He was born to a village family with a musical background. His grandfather, a sitarist, took him to see a touring drama troupe when he was very young, and this experience created a memorable impression on him. Today, he attended strict rehearsals presided over by the disciplinarian Tunti. His first important role was that of the Sabspari in Amanat's Indrasala, and he went on to perform the female leads in Chitra Bakavli, Guru Zarina, and Sitambara. Sundari perfected his knowledge of Urdu and developed his characteristic feminine gait during his apprenticeship with the Farsi company. His trademark became a distinctive stage entry, which created a mesmeric appeal. He returned to Gujarat for studies briefly at the age of 11, but a year later he was chosen by Bapulal Nayak as his female counterpart, and he joined the Gujarati Natak Mandir in Bombay at 20 rupees a month. He soon mastered the Gujarati language and achieved resounding success with his debut in Saubhagya Sundari in 1901. He then played the character of Ramba, Dudwali, in Vikram Charitra in 1902. This play was performed 160 times every Saturday night for over 3 years. Sundari's fame in the Dudwali role seems to have been based on a particular scene through women's dress and behavior. First, he expanded the 9-yard Maharashtrian sari to 10 yards. Later, in life, when he had gained weight, he switched to the 6-yard version, which I don't quite understand. But apparently, wrapping it not through the legs, but just around the body, he was able to manage. He popularized embroidered jackets that were worn over sari blouses and brought into vogue hairstyles such as the bun. Strings of flowers worn in the hair, jewelry such as the nut, and the practice of carrying handkerchiefs are also credited to him. And somewhat surprisingly, he also set the tone for men's fashions. The Gandharv cap, Gandharv turban, and Gandharv coat and trousers, which I'm sorry, I don't know what these are, so maybe someone can help me out. Photos of him in his female roles adorned the drawing rooms of elite homes, and many firms. His next film, he played Mirabai, 1937. This was also a flop for some reason. Well, then sneak in his dressings. This ribald, comic mode of cross-dressing is found in various folk theater forms and was probably a feature of the farcical skits that were presented after the main drama in an evening of Parsi theater. For some spectators, it may have been the primary position from which female impersonation was viewed. But I would suggest that in contrast, the kind of roles mentioned in connection with Sundari and Bal Gandharv indicate a high mimetic mode of female impersonation, particularly in conjunction with scenes of pathos and tragedy as found in the epics and domestic melodramas. The many references to an acting method based on identification with feminine sensibility suggest that in these roles, actors tried to disguise their male gender characteristics entirely. Photographs of our male heroines with heads bent in submission, or eyes gazing up to the hero, or body turned away coquettishly, show the match between these actors' poses and iconic postures of the feminine. The internalization of these gestures by the female spectatorship marked a new direction in theater art. For instead of fearing the transvestite, the viewer was instructed to model herself on him, particularly through the figure of the tragic woman, the wronged wife, the victim, the abala nari, the female impersonator was rendered non-threatening, a stimulant of tears rather than titillation. This spectatorial position made possible the notion that the female impersonator portrayed the societal ideal of femininity. Indeed, by virtue of his allegedly superior histrionic talents deployed in the summoning of pathos, the female impersonator was said to surpass any woman in his representation of the beauty of womanly suffering. Not in opposition to these kinds of reading, but more difficult to trace in the historical record, I would also suggest an underlying homoerotic valence that linked the gazes of hero and male heroine on stage and heroine and male spectator in the theater hall. Hints of this emerge in comments such as that of the actor Lunde, who playing opposite Bal Gandharv felt a, quote, unique thrill pass through his veins when he stood close by, or references to the, quote, lusty applause of the college boys when Bal Gandharv as Shakuntala entered the stage, surrounded by her companions.
बहुत ही रोचक और महत्वपूर्ण विषय पर इतनी सावधानी और इतने परिश्रम से तैयार किया हुआ दफ्तर दिल्ली के रंगकर्मियों और रंग प्रेमियों के सामने प्रस्तुत किया। मुझे यकीन है कि आपके वक्तव्य को लेकर बहुत सारे सवाल लोगों को मिलने होंगे। इसके पहले कि मैं लोगों से प्रश्नों के लिए आमंत्रित करूं, मैं एक बात इसका विशेष रूप से उल्लेख करना चाहता हूं कि पारसी थिएटर में स्त्रियों की भूमिका के विषय पर इस गोष्ठी में या इस सभा में हमारे प्रमुख पारसी रंगमंच के अभिनेता मास्टर फिदा हुसैन नरसिंह यहाँ मौजूद हैं और ये बड़े हमारे लिए गौरव और खुशी की बात है। उनके लिए बहुत आभारी हैं और ये वक्तव्य और ये सारा आयोजन उनकी इस उपस्थिति से बहुत ही गरिमामय हो गया है, इसलिए मैं विशेष रूप से बहुत खुशी। मैं अब आप सबको आमंत्रित करता हूँ कि आप डॉक्टर मिशन के इस रोचक विषय के बारे में अपने प्रश्नों से प्रश्न कीजिए।
Since the chairman has announced that some gentlemen from the Parsi sector is here, expert, I think it will be in fitness of the thing if we request that person to give his comments on the research paper presented by the Natarang.
The women in the Bengal theatre by way of any interest or comparison?
That the situation in Bengal was rather different in that much earlier actresses achieved stature on the stage and a degree of respectability. I don't think it really changes my conclusions, but it is important to put the achievements of the Parsi stage in comparison with all of these other urban stages, because in fact they were in contact with each other continuously throughout this period, and they influenced each other a great deal.
The stage of giving women an equal opportunity of acting, it wasn't a stigma so much, it was some stigma in the beginning. Have any particular influence in the history of women coming on the stage in other states such as Bombay?
I've looked at 19th century newspapers in English in Bombay, and I have to confess, they're more interested in what's going on in the stage in London than they are what's happening in Calcutta. So, I really don't know to what extent they would have been aware. But
The British virus, which is troubling you right now in the form of a cold, was it some kind of a Victorian morality which was also affecting and blocking the entrance of the professional female performer in India to the Parsi stage? Because historically Parsi stage is a style which developed
under the great impact of realism, under the impact of the structure of plays which were restructured from traditional myths into a kind of Western scheme. So how much is it that Victorian attitude, that a respectable woman, middle class, and the definitions of middle class now, urban middle class for India have to follow certain Western notions also. So could you make an observation on that?
Was a wholesale imitation of Victorian stage is first of all far from the mark. There are records, again, in the 19th century English language newspapers of a number of English companies and even Italian opera companies and circus companies and dog and pony shows, you name it. There were all manner of amusements that were available to the British and presumably the elite Indian public in the big cities. And I have to say that women played a very important part. Often the proprietress is mentioned at the bottom of the ad, and they are women. British women were very active in this period and even, got on those ships and came all the way over, to perform over here, toured all over the country and so on. So, I mean, if we're actually, hypothesizing that the Parsi theater was an imitation of the Victorian stage as present in India, I can't see the connection.
Destruction of the new middle class respectable woman. How much of the Victorian sentiment comes in? Because traditionally the female performer in India and the female transvestite, the male acting as female and female acting, it's a very, very old thing, and all over India there is a whole tradition of it. So why this blockage that occurs at this particular historical time?
I think it enlarged primarily upon men to control their women in various ways. Okay. And I mean, this has a major impact on women's lives as well. So certainly the general point is well taken. At the same time, I would just point out that, as I tried to outline, there were plenty of women who wanted to participate. In fact, after 1857 and after the imposition of legislation to control the districts, the red light districts in various urban sectors of India, these women were in a very difficult position. They couldn't follow their traditional professions, and they were in search of employment. So this has to be taken into account as well, that there in fact was another culture available in which women had been performing all along, no doubt cloaked in disrepute.
I was wondering if
men were performing the role of women in Shakespeare's time. My simple question is that do you think that the social compulsions which prevented women from entering the stage at that time and the social compulsions for women not doing the roles on the stage, can you make some kind of comparison between the two different societies, two different cultures separated by 400 years ago?
This new phase of Indian theater in the 19th century. There's so much debate about what it meant in the Renaissance to have cross-dressed actors on the stage. I mean, it's currently a topic of a great deal of debate and discussion in scholarship. And people are trying to do things like compare the roles of, women in the society, the changing class structure in the society. One argument that I find rather compelling is that it was a period when class boundaries were being breached, when there was a great deal of social change and inner transformation occurring in the society. And because of that, people projected some of their anxiety about class onto gender, because in fact one's position in the society is very often leads to gender equations being adjusted or used as a sort of substitute. So perhaps in that sense it would be true. I think what I'm trying to understand, and I do seek your help in this, is how this very old Indian practice in the traditional theaters entered the urban space and entered the modern space. Because obviously the female impersonators are still there in many theaters. The traditional theaters of Kathakali and Ras Leela, in other theaters in India, one still finds this, and it goes on. But within this theater world marked by the Western style of stagecraft, the proscenium arch, the theater halls, this urban populace who now see theater going as a sign of distinction, and who are coming into that space to show their modernity. They are also, adopting in some way. They're reworking this old practice and adjusting it to their circumstances. And that's what fascinates me, and frankly, I'm not sure I've totally understood it.
Impersonators earn. Your point about Parsi theater being the first commercial theater, and I wonder if economic competition might not have been playing a large part in this desire of men to keep women on the stage.
To discipline the female and mold her into a certain form, but a kind of enjoyment and pleasure in that form as it comes into the visual realm. And of course there was money attached to that pursuit. I'm not sure if that really explains anything else. I don't know.
On the stage, I was wondering if you went back to one of your earlier propositions, which was the actual transformation of the mythical content of the plays into something else, whether another set of relations might begin to appear. For example, how do we look at a play like Indra Sabha, which was one of the classics of the genre and which sort of probably had hundreds of female impersonators, all over. How do you actually see that as a modern play? I mean, when you realize that it's not at all cast in any mimetic language, do we see the modernity as, really effect of the way it is staged? Or do you actually see it in terms of the way stories cast and the women are, emblematized? I mean, how would you look at it? If you looked at it like that, maybe some of these questions might begin to...
a piece. I mean, it's a drama that is focused on celebrating what was lost in Ovid, the life of pomp and ease and music and dance and so on. And I think its nostalgia is part of the reason for its success throughout, moving right up into the 20th century. But I guess I would say it's, it moves into this new realm when it comes out of Lucknow and it comes down to Bombay and gets produced in a proscenium theater on Grant Road for a ticket-buying public who come in to be seen by others and, who no doubt are on a continuum with their former practices of viewing and listening, but something new is there because of the framing of this experience. And there is a kind of discipline that's brought into that. And I think that, within this, the role of the woman and the demarcation of her boundaries becomes a very crucial point, but there's a period of confusion over that. And it takes a while for that to settle in. So there's no doubt that, the most popular plays continue to be the old mythological, some historical romances that had this element of nostalgia. And that, in terms of subject, in terms of acting styles as well, there's a great deal of reworking of traditional so-called theater techniques, music, dance, etc. I mean, this is an Indian practice. I don't mean to say, as I pointed out before, I don't view it as a kind of foreign import. There's a great deal of synthesis going on there. Use of the woman within the city space forms something new or allegedly modern.
Abula Nari role that they played represented or, let's say, heightened a particular stereotype. On the other hand, the earlier roles also, from what I understand, projected such personalities as Nadia Hunter-Rai. So, would you like to believe that the total impact of the movement, Parsi theatre movement, on the stereotype was, shall I say, a positive one in the modern sense today? That is question one. And there's one more observation, that communalism as we know it today took a certain form during 1870s, from what I understand, right, because it started getting divided along Urdu and Hindi, between the Muslims and the Hindus. Now, the thing is that Parsi theatre, on the other hand, would seem like the melting pot of like composite culture represented both by the two communities as well as two languages. So it would seem that it was taking, it was following a totally different direction at precisely the same point in time. We have known the history of Tamilicism only, if I may say so, through the male protagonist. Now, since the female protagonist in Parsi theatre was an amalgamation of the two extremes, do you think that has had any influence whatsoever on the female aspects of feminism? Thank you.
Further research and thought into that. As far as the first one goes, I mean, as stereotypes go, I don't think any of them are positive. You know, stereotypes are kind of rigid forms that assume a sort of force beyond their actual validity. So I hope I haven't given the impression that I'm sort of endorsing any kind of stereotypical notions of femininity, masculinity, or anything. What I'm trying to say is that the impact, the social impact of actors on stage dressed as women extended to their gender roles in society to some extent. Of course, it's very difficult to speculate to what it's difficult to establish to what extent. We can only speculate how far people are actually influenced by television, by movies, by theater, etc., to change their behavior. I'm trying to synthesize what is available in the record and what people have said, and to what extent it's, true in terms of historical, what one can actually document and so on. I'm not really in a position to judge, but I suppose the larger point there is simply that we should look at the theater also as a place, as a site where gender roles are created as well as reflected. And that the stage has played a very major role, just as the cinema does it today, in influencing gender relations in every society.
Nation get transferred into the modern theatre, so to say. And the difference in the fact that in Bengal it did not happen that way, while in Maharashtra it did. In Maharashtra, Gujarat, maybe it has something to do with the origin, the way Marathi modern, let's say, modern theatre rather than Sangli started. That it began really with the influence of or through the Yakshagan tradition transformed into the Sangeetan, transformed into the kind of natak Vishnudas Bhavya was doing. And therefore, while there was another kind of structure at work, the entire sensibility was very Indian as compared to, let's say, Bengali. And therefore, in the Maharashtra belt, Bombay belt, this, so that continuity of the tradition of the female impersonator, I think, might have remained. And then, of course, the inertia of having to think that there should be people. I think the practical problems, as I have been told by several people who interacted with Parsi theatre companies, that they were constantly worried that if there were too many women or any women in the entourage, there would be scandals and there would be pregnancies and there would be problems that kind in terms of management, which would bring disrepute, quote unquote, to the company. That is, I think, could be one of the reasons why it so happened from that area. And since the entire Parsi theatre originated there, probably that's another reason why it continues into the Parsi. I don't know.
Thank you. As a great area of investigation, but obviously it would be very hard to research in the absence of total information. The whole area of sexuality, what to do to the gendering and non-gendering roles. So I don't know if there's a starting point there that in terms of modernity, when theatre came and made life, it could be dramatized, and then the romantic and the idealizing of roles became public for the first time. And in doing so, the woman, as you said, became visible. She had to be who had to dramatize life. And the fact that coming from the traditional moralistic urban middle class, where access to women per se, even a romantic notion was not there. And theatre per se, and the fact that you could have female roles to idolize, as you mentioned, more erotic, brought in all kinds of aspects where you could have women to romanticize, idolize, etc. But they're actually men, it's safe. You can be attracted, you can, feel drawn to them, and they are real impersonators. But it's okay, it's safe, because even if you're extending that kind of romantic visual effect, they're not really women, so you're not really breaking them all down. Just drawing from the fact that even if one looks at roles of transvestite responses in a more cruder sense of men to them, it's actually a level of comfort to be able to address men dressed as women and respond to them as women, but always knowing that they're men and so forth. So perhaps somewhere until it became okay and society loosened up enough for women to be able to be on stage and deal with the disrepute of it and some of the problems that people said, scandals and romances and pregnancies and whatever. There was so much of a safer space even for men to get fascinated by these impersonators, to be attracted to them. And what would be really interesting is to find out what happened to the sexuality of these persons, the experiences they had. How did men actually respond to them? What happened to their personal relationships? Which would be a whole area which would probably answer something.
I think he wants to venture into that terrain, and I think it is an important part of the story, no doubt. I would like to know more about whether there were any sort of community structures among female impersonators. If it was just an individual preference kind of thing, or how people lived, and in what social forms. Aside from private areas of so-called sexuality. I think there's a social dimension to the erotic and the sexual, which is very difficult to actually pinpoint within a world as complex and multi-layered and also kind of shrouded as theater. A lot goes on in the theater that is not on the stage, right? So, but I think your points also bring up another area of inquiry for me, which is why did it end? Was it just that women became acceptable on stage? Well, how acceptable actually are they? Or did female impersonators become unacceptable? And why? And was this because of a kind of loss of innocence in the area of sexuality and gender boundaries? So I would be very interested to pursue the research in that direction in order to kind of close off the era with some sense of, well, where are we going after this whole practice winds down? And what does that mean for sexual boundaries in the society now?
What I wanted to say was that much was involved in not accepting or allowing by the authorities of the family and society for the women to come on the stage was really a question of respectability and not hurting the so-called dignity and the living code of the given family. And therefore, men, and it shows the value system, the men could do what they wanted to do, that wouldn't be taken seriously. But if a woman, even in acting, did anything, and as you would still notice, kissing was very, very rare even in Indian Hindi film. With all kinds of vulgarities, you would never see that. Why? It is because some of the constraint and some fantastic ideas in the mind of so-called leaders of society or whatever that really affects a society which know how to think but will not think because of being afraid of the taboos. So in a meeting, a man must ask questions and talk, but a woman was too daring. Never I'd suggest that this inhibition that we see less perhaps was very much pronounced in those times, and in a way, knowingly or unknowingly crippled a woman's acting on the theatre, but couldn't curb them finally. Thank you.
the Parsi community in establishing this theater and in the ownership and leadership in the early troops. And of course, a number of Parsi men were very active on the stage, and as female impersonators as well as in other roles. Parsi women did not come onto the stage. They were not allowed onto the stage. But the interesting, kind of corollary of that is if it's a woman of some other community, it's okay. But for the woman of your community to come is a problem. And this goes back to respectability being tied to family, to clan, to community, ultimately to nation, but that's further down the line. That isn't in this period so much. So that the second part of the paper is actually an exploration of how it is that the so-called Anglo-Indian actress dominated the Parsi theater when actresses came onto the stage. And these so-called Anglo-Indians are in case a number of different groups are represented under that. Some actually were of mixed British and Indian blood. Some were members of the Baghdadi Jewish community. Very important actresses such as Sulochana, Ruby Myers was Jewish. And then there were a number of Muslim women involved who were from the Tawaif communities. And these women continue. In fact, there's a very clear progression into the era of cinema and silent cinema. And it's not simply that these are the women who are available. There's a premium placed on their exotic whiteness, on their, on their foreign appearance, on their ability to represent a kind of spectacle of the other. So to the extent that one does have a woman on the stage, she'd better not be your own woman. Some other kind of woman is much more interesting to look at.
A part of India, which seems to support what Kathy is saying, this movement to class. I would say a movement from a gendered society to a class-based society, is that even in the Devadasi dance tradition of Tamil Nadu, it needed a man dressed up as a woman. The tradition was danced by women. It was a solo performance, sadir, done by women. But it moved in the modern period through E. Krishna Iyer, a Brahmin male dressed as a woman, to the modern day Bharatanatyam, which is a totally different class of woman, is dancing it. So there seems to be something here about the man's role in this transition, on the one hand, and I ask you to think about it, and equally from a gendered society to neutral to gender. So today even men could be dancing sadir, and just as you mentioned, other women are taking to drama. I mean, I don't think it's to do just with being man and being woman, but the class basis of these situations in society.
Long history in a number of societies, and in fact one can also look at female impersonation in that regard, because in a number of societies the third gender, whether it's whatever you want to call it, the hermaphrodite, eunuch, whatever, has had a ritual, a sacrality attached to it. And I think, same thing for maleness in certain ritual contexts, same thing for femaleness in other ritual contexts. So this provides a whole other dimension. And then at a certain historical moment, those ritual associations break down, are no longer dominant. I mean, they no longer control the association between performance and gender. Other factors become more significant.
But actually, you have already told that your whole survey is based on some English paper, newspaper, or paper in Bombay. So,
She hasn't said that.
He didn't say that.
so therefore, whenever we, and at the same time, you have not done some survey with the ritual as you have called it. So my submission is that in your review, when you say Indian woman, please write in bracket to which state, because it is very damaging. Some statement is made, and supposing I go to some country and I just pick one area and I say the whole country, no. I really have to worry about this, because when the survey is based on a small area, so how, number one. Number two is that your whole thesis should also keep in mind the development of the culture. The Indian women were not attracted by economic factors. Indian women, if we read our culture, our religion, there is a different purpose altogether.
As a final point, I was just wanting to ask one question from, without a second, one last question from Fida Hussain ji in relation to his experience. Yes, Fida ji, आप जब करते थे उस समय औरतें भी एक्ट करती थी स्टेज पर?
आदरणीय सज्जनों, श्रद्धेय नेमचंद जी, यहाँ उपस्थित सभी आदरणीय सज्जनों, सन 1864 में फारसी शैली के नाम से सबसे पहले कंपनी खरशैद जी बालीवाला थिएट्रिकल कंपनी ऑफ बॉम्बे, ये खरशैद जी बालीवाला उस दौर में जो बहुत सारे पारसियों ने अपनी एमेचर क्लब बना रखे थे, उसमें कॉमेडियन थे और ट्रेजिक में सबसे बड़े कलाकार थे जहांगीर जी खंबाता। तो ये पहली कंपनी बनी और क्योंकि इसके कर्ता धर्ता पारसी थे, इसलिए पारसी शैली नाम पड़ा।
फिदा जी, मेरा सवाल था कि आपके समय में औरतें नाटकों में करती
तो मैं जब कंपनी में सन 17 में गया हूँ अपने घर से भाग करके, क्योंकि बहुत पिटाई होती थी, बहुत नाराज थे घर वाले। तो उस जमाने में नियर फ्रेड के अलावा जितनी कंपनियां थी सब में औरतें आ चुकी थी, लेकिन औरतों की शुरुआत सबसे पहले बालीवाला थिएटर में ही हुई। गुलजार और बिजली दो बाजारू औरतें थिएटर में आई और उसके बाद दूसरी कंपनियों ने भी कावजी खटाउकियां, गौहर, मेरी फैंटन और इसके अलावा जितनी भी कंपनियां थी, अल्फ्रेड में मुन्नी बाई और करीब करीब सभी कंपनियों में औरतें आ गई थी। एकमात्र नियर फ्रेड कंपनी थी जिसमें महात्मा गांधी, पंडित मदन मोहन मालवीय, मोतीलाल नेहरू ऐसे खास लोग या कंपनी में आते थे, क्योंकि उसमें स्त्रियां नहीं थी। वो ऐसा दौर था कि स्त्रियां जो थिएटर में आती थी वो बाजार से ही लाई जाती थी, सोसाइटी का तो कोई जिक्र ही नहीं था। इसीलिए लोगों ने कुछ इसको कमजोरी करार दिया और उसके बाद जब औरतें, पढ़ी लिखी भी औरतें आने लगी तो फिर इसको बहुत तरक्की मिली। और आज जो आप देख रहे हैं कि पारसी थिएटर ही ने हिंदी की भी बहुत बड़ी सेवा की है और उसी के चलते हुए आज हिंदी राष्ट्र की भाषा के रूप में मानी जा रही है। तो औरतों का जहां तक सवाल है, वो सबसे पहले बालीवाला में आई, उसके बाद दूसरी कंपनियों में आने लगी। यही बात कहकर मैं अपनी बात।
एक और सवाल फिदा जी, एक और सवाल कि जो आपने देखा होगा जो औरतें करती होंगी एक्टिंग, और आपने बहुत से लड़कियों के रोल किए हैं और आपने और भी लोगों को देखा होगा, पुरुषों को। आपको क्या लगता है दोनों में से कौन ज्यादा बेहतर करते थे?
इसकी मिसाल महाराष्ट्र में बाल गंधर्व रंगमंच गुजराती में जयशंकर सुंदरी और कंपनियों में गौहर, शरीफा बाई, ये। लेकिन बाल गंधर्व और जयशंकर सुंदरी के मुकाबले के वो लोग नहीं कर सके। जयशंकर सुंदरी ने जो चाल चली, जो साड़ी पहनी, वो पूरे गुजराती समाज में पहनावा शुरू हो गया। बाल गंधर्व ने जो साड़ी पहनी, मराठी जो लिबास मराठी में चलता था, उस फैशन की साड़ी पहनी और जो चाल चली थिएटर के अंदर, वो चाल और वो साड़ी इतनी मकबूल हुई कि महाराष्ट्र के घर घर में पहुंच गई। तो मैं यही कहूंगा कि पुरुष कलाकार जो लेडीज फीमेल पार्ट करने वाले थे वो उनसे कमजोर नहीं थे बल्कि उनसे आगे ही थे। अंत में मैं मेहमान खुसूसी मुख्य अतिथि छोड़ी रंगमंच के लिए कुछ कहने के लिए बाकी नहीं रखा है। इसके विषय में आपको धन्यवाद देते हुए एक शेर आपकी खिदमत में पेश कर रहा हूँ। जाम चलने लगे दिल मचलने लगे, जाम चलने लगे दिल मचलने लगे, अंजुमन झूम उठी बज़्म लहरा गई। आज महफिल में लेडी जी क्या आ गई, जैसे गुलशन में फसलें बहार। और इसके साथ ही सबको धन्यवाद दे रहा हूँ, खास करके नेमचंद जी को और अपनी अजीज मोहतरमा श्रीमती कीर्ति जी को और उनकी बहनों को, सभी को धन्यवाद देता हूँ कि उन्होंने रंगमंच के लिए जो कुछ भी खिदमत की है और जो कुछ कर रहे हैं। मुझे उम्मीद है कि आगे भी ये जारी रहेगा और एक नई दिशा भी रंगमंच को फिर से मिलेगी, रंगमंच कायम रहेगा, यही बहुत बड़ी बात होगी। जय हिंद।
बातचीत में आप शामिल हुए। मैं सिर्फ एक छोटी सी कहानी आपको सुनाना चाहता हूँ। लगभग 37 बरस पहले मैं यहाँ एक छात्र था, तो मुझे अपने को शिक्षित करने की मैंने एक पद्धति ये बना रखी थी कि जो भी प्रदर्शन होते थे वो सब देखने जाता था। मैं एक प्रदर्शन था वेदांतम सत्यनारायण शर्मा का, जो त्रिपुरी के बहुत प्रख्यात कलाकार है। सतुर हाउस उन दिनों इतनी खराब जगह नहीं थी जितनी आजकल हो गई। उन दिनों तो वही एकमात्र जगह थी और बड़ी अच्छी जगह थी, बड़े अच्छे रिस्पेक्टेबल लोग वहाँ आते थे, जिसमें जवाहरलाल नेहरू वगैरह भी शामिल थे। तो बहरहाल मैं थोड़ी देर से पहुंचा और तब तक नृत्य का प्रदर्शन शुरू हो गया। एंड देयर वाज अ वेरी ब्यूटीफुल लेडी डांसिंग एंड आई थॉट maybe there was some mistake that I have committed, that this is not a performance by Vedantam Satyanarayan Sharma, perhaps this is a performance by some lady. And very cleverly, all the announcements were made in such a way that you couldn't make out that it was a male. You know, it was said, now there will be Mandub Shabdam, now there will be this, that and the other. And it kept on like that, and I kept on watching, saying, a very beautiful lady, dancing very well. But why is it that I came to understand that this is Vedantam Satyanarayan Sharma's disciple? I kept on thinking the chap sitting there, like looking like a guru, the Natarang or somebody like that, must have been Vedantam Satyanarayan Sharma, and this lady is a disciple. Until the last item came. And then the announcement was made, with this Vedantam Satyanarayan Sharma concludes his recital. I have never been duped in my life so wonderfully as that. So there was a great tradition, obviously, which must have played its own role as was being discussed. But thank you very much for coming, and I think we have very interesting discussion and some very interesting issues have been raised which can engage our attention in future. Thank you very much.